Welcome to my talk at Atlassian Team 21 on what I wish I'd known, moving Splunk's 10,000 users to cloud. This talk will cover the steps we took to migrate to cloud, but won't cover the exact migration process. That itself is an entirely different talk for another time. As part of the agenda, I'll take you through the assumptions and plans that Splunk had for their Atlassian applications into the future. This didn't originally include Atlassian Cloud. Then I'll take you through thinking about cloud and how you can change your mindset to think about how Atlassian Cloud can support your business. Then learning cloud, such as the concepts. And finally, what I wish I'd known. And hopefully this will assist with your own cloud journey. So looking at Atlassian at Splunk, our future was that we had a business strategy to reduce our overall data center footprint by moving services to public cloud. This didn't take too much convincing to me to align with the strategy, because that ultimately meant a lift and shift of existing data center applications of Jira and Confluence. I'd done this before, and I knew exactly what steps to take. It was a path that was very comfortable to me, and to the point where we started to hire in team members with the skills to assist with it. We started doing diagrams, we started making out timelines, and we were ready to go. But in a moment which can best be described as the screeching sound of a record from a DJ, there was one question that stopped this in its tracks. And that was from our CIO, who asked casually, have we considered Atlassian Cloud? Now, I had immediate reactions to that question, and they weren't all necessarily positive. But when a senior leadership member asks you that question, as casual as it sounded at the time, it really needed inspection to understand both where the question had come from and from my immediate reactions to that. And when I thought about my reaction alone, it came down to what I ask of others previously when I've asked them to move to Jira and Confluence from some other application. And it's one of the most expensive business phrases that I ever hear. And now it was coming out of my mouth when I heard it. And that was, we've always done it this way. We've always managed on-premise infrastructure. Atlassian Cloud was different. But I was the one who was now resisting the change. And I had to understand what was causing this. So my team are employed to bring the best solution to the table when it comes to Atlassian applications. And this hadn't always been cloud. So why was that? Why were we not proposing this? And why did I have the immediate reaction to say no to when our CIO had asked that question? And maybe we should be thinking about cloud. So with that fundamentally, the reason I had that response was it was our own biases. And my team, when we went through and looked at the reason that they hadn't thought about it too, was that they'd seen the history. We hadn't thought about cloud because our collective biases dismissed it. I've been around a long time to see cloud evolve. And maybe one of the biggest biases was that it always kept changing. Maybe it wasn't ever ready for us. Apps behave differently. It looks different. But when you think about it, right, we were infrastructure people. We'd managed servers, switches, hardware for a long, long time. And we may have this direct thinking that, if we proposed cloud, we'll do ourselves out of a job. But the other thing too, though, is if you don't align with the business, you will absolutely find yourself out of a job if you're not aligning with the business needs. And if we consider what's changed, particularly at Splunk in the last 12 months, as we've moved to more software as a service, we were the ones who weren't proposing to do the same and to be flexible with our workforce. It was very easy to come up with technical blockers about why it can't be moved. Things like apps, or the migration is going to be hard, or the data load is different, or there's going to be change. But if I look back at the roadmap that my team had made, we had solved some of the hardest technical blockers ever. So proposing technical blockers are absolute things that we could solve. But you know what? I'm responsible for our company bill. And when I looked at it, I was continuing to see this increase in licenses through some of our fastest growing teams. And new acquisitions that we brought in were also cloud-first businesses. So while cloud was in our business, we hadn't necessarily recognized it because it was different. It was unfamiliar to us. And we hadn't necessarily yet addressed some of the reasonings about why those teams were using cloud. And we certainly hadn't yet addressed some of the problems integrating it because, again, it was different. And we didn't necessarily see it as something that needed to be done right now. We'll do it in the future. But the future was starting to be here. And I mentioned about integrating these cloud sites. Well, that was change. We had to change how we did on-prem, and we had to start to apply it to these mergers and acquisitions. And that's hard because we were no longer experts in it. Someone would ask us a question about how we can do this in cloud. We didn't necessarily have the answer. And that, I think, itself was dawning on us. And you have to start to learn. That's probably one of the hardest things. And we had to start to address some of these significant problems that we're having with things like automation and provisioning. One example that comes to mind is the help desk team telling me one day that we're going through calls, we're noticing that the automation for new hire onboards for those using Atlassian Cloud was about 5%, whereas on-prem was 95%. That was clearly a shortcoming that we'd put in place. We hadn't addressed the things like the onboarding, but that was now starting to hurt. And so we started to address these immediate problems, things like the automation to increase that experience for our new hires, all the while thinking, if we migrate to cloud, how is this going to help us and help the organization in the future? And many times I found myself being that one person who is that old man yelling at cloud. Why can't you be more like server? Why can't you operate the same? And it dawned on me that it's different. It's a different product. It's using different technologies. So I had to now start to learn. But it was, I'll be honest, it was during those times when I started to see how cloud was implementing some of these steps that the result of it was an epiphany. And that was cloud was in both our future and Atlassian's future. So once you've understood that and how cloud can support you in the future, it's addressing those product knowledge gaps. I had significant gaps in about how cloud would work together with things like account provisioning, Atlassian access for identity, how sites would work together. And through our technical account manager, he facilitated conversations with the product managers, which I have fond memories now of even the product managers describing the importance of colors and boundaries within the UI and what that signifies. And once we started to work with Atlassian about how cloud could support us, then the gaps that started to be filled, there was still one piece that was the mystery. And that was, how do we get from on-prem to cloud? And it was meeting with the cloud migration managers 6 months before we started to realize that this was in our future and our license renewals are coming up, that there was one piece they brought to the table. And that was this. These are the 3 options that we have to move to cloud. Now, this may change over time as the tools get better and the tools change. But this single page I have shared dozens of times with people about how cloud is going to be in our future and how we're going to move to it and what the steps will be involved in that process. But so that means now we've got the learnings of how cloud works, the technologies, and what the migration steps are going to be. But there are things that I wish I'd known before, but that took months to get to, that I hope will assist you with your own journey. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that after all this, we did sign an agreement with Atlassian for Enterprise Cloud. And now I'll start to take you through things I wish I'd known. First of all, not all apps that you use have a migration pathway. Some have pathways better to others, and some will require manual intervention. But you do need to spend a lot of time evaluating the apps that you use. And I encourage you to start as early as possible. There are apps that would have been introduced years ago that you may not have been involved in, and you may not understand the business value that they currently have, but you will need to understand those so that you'll have your current state of apps and what your future state of apps will look like. This will eventually lead to a quoting process, and need to ensure that you have as many of those apps covered with their migration pathway as possible. We could have spent months. We can still spend more months looking at all the apps we have. But I got to a point where I was at about an 85% confidence level that I could decide, yeah, okay, this is enough. We can move forward with this. There are probably 1 or 2 apps that I've missed, but that's not the end of the world. We can get those included later on. But if you have data that needs to be migrated, you absolutely need to know what those apps are. one of the things that's very easy to do is once you've decided that you'll be moving to cloud, is to start to put together a proposal that is just about cloud. We need to understand there may be some products that will need to remain self-hosted. At Splunk, we have a variety of reasons for why there are some products that need to remain on self-hosted. And so I encourage you to have a comparison about if we did nothing today and we remained on-prem, what would that look like for the next 4 years? And then compare it with a full proposal of moving all of the products that you have that you can to cloud, as well as those that stay on-prem. And what does that look like? You might be surprised about how the economics work of that long-term. But in doing so, though, also consider this an opportunity to optimize your investment. There may be some products you need more licenses of, and you may find there are others you need less of. And there may also be points at which the pricing works better to buy more of something than less of something else. But yeah, include the whole picture for your migration to cloud and recognize that there may be reasons that some things need to stay on premise that you'll need to look after. Now, I mentioned how it took me many months to get my head around moving to cloud and how it's going to benefit us. You should also acknowledge that your colleagues in legal and procurement and information security also need to have the benefit of this. And so get them involved early, right? They're going to help you understand what needs to be taken to get yourself to cloud. And they're also going to need to likely speak to Atlassian as well. And that gives both parties plenty of time. So you're not trying to rush this through at the end when you're trying to do your renewals. So just encourage you to get those stakeholders in early. In doing so, though, you also need to start to explain to your stakeholders, people from engineering, people from your product teams, about what they will need to do as well. There are likely to be integrations that need to change. And you need to understand those integrations may need many sprints in advance notice for those teams to change. Explain to them that while it may have the same product names, it's a different product in cloud, and you need to get them on board too to understand how you can help them migrate. Simple things like claiming your site in advance. We didn't claim our site until later on, but it's actually needed for the quoting process. In doing so too, we realized that we needed to move all of our existing sites into the one organization to assist with some of that automation that we were lacking. We had sites that were in 2 different organizations, and we needed 2 lots of API keys to manage them, when a simple thing is to move them into one organization. So when you start to do that, though, you start to realize that there's one thing, and our TAM mentioned it early on, is how about we create a tenant map that looked at how these teams would work? Now, we were thinking about servers. And so we were thinking about moving 10,000 user instance of Jira and Confluence on-prem to cloud. And we're going to do exactly the same. So I'm just going to take a little bit longer here to explain the importance of this tenant map. So if you adopt the server thinking in cloud, you actually can't realize the full benefits of all of Atlassian's technologies when you do this. If you just take your existing on-premise and just replicate it in cloud, you are essentially doing what you've done before, but now just in cloud. For us, it looks like this, right? As experienced administrators, we build big instances on server that optimize upgrades, optimize app purchases, licenses for different products. It's just the best way to do it because that's how you do it on-prem. But in cloud, you use the benefit of an organization and multiple sites. And this means you can do role-based sites. So there may be teams in engineering, for example, that require one set of apps, while teams in places like finance and HR and IT require a different set of apps. By doing tenants that are licensed at the level that you need them, means you can optimize your spend in your apps. So you don't need to license one app that engineering uses in HR and finance, for example, but also means you can separate some of the risk, things like mergers and acquisitions or legal, who can then have their own instance, their own tenant, without impacting others and without having the possibility of leaking information across other teams. So I encourage you to put a tenant map in place. If you were to split your one large server instance into several small instances, how would you do it? And what would the licensing look like? And how would that impact which apps you license for each tenant? The reason you do this before you sign an agreement is because then you can negotiate with the app vendors to get the right apps in the right place at the right time. And I mentioned before about organization and sites and products. You will need to get familiar with those. there is no comparison to the on-premise infrastructure when you talk about sites, products, and organizations. So you really need to understand them. There were points when I spoke to the product managers when I didn't have an understanding of it. And it does lead to some confusion sometimes if you use them interchangeably. And from that though, right, if you're very experienced, you might think that you know all this, but don't be afraid to ask. I mentioned before about a product manager explaining to me the benefits of having things set up in a particular way and why the colors in a particular square look like something. So I encourage you to ask, sometimes through support, through your TAM, or through product teams. One thing we didn't do until later on though, however, was actually try the migration. So using what the steps that the cloud migration managers had provided us, I then started to run the migration. And in my mind, I'd already assumed how long a migration would take. But the first time I ran our migration for Jira, it took 26 hours, which was surprising considering the timeline I put forward for doing a migration over a weekend. There were many failures until I started to put together an automation migration script, and this reduced the migration time from 26 hours to 12. But in doing the migration, however, and doing some trial runs, it did point out that I couldn't do this all on my own. And for complex migrations, a solution partner is definitely a must. So the earlier you can identify solution partners that can work with you, the better. That also may assist you with the app migration pathway because they may have already done this before. In doing so though, it's starting to see the sandbox environment and the sample migration that are put together. It indicated one thing, and that was that migrating to Atlassian Cloud unlocked functionality that Data Center could never deliver. This is functionality that Splunk will need in the future. And it's functionality that if my team continued down the same pathway of always doing the things how we've always done them, we would hold back functionality from everyone at Splunk. And so with that, I really ask you, are you doing things how you've always done them? And are you open to changing? Thank you.